Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead has to be one of the most famous utterances in U.S. naval history. The man who said it is pictured here, Rear Admiral David Farragut. You see him in this wonderful 19th century image, lashed to the rigging, the rope around his waist, the rigging behind him. He's standing close to a mast. He's overlooking his fleet as it's moving into Mobile Bay in one of the most memorable ocean battles, sea battles of the American Civil War and of the entire history of the U.S. Navy. So we've got that famous utterance and that famous battle. Of course, you students of the Civil War know that those famous words aren't exactly the way he said that order. It's a paraphrase, but the words carry forth today and they convey accurately the meaning of what he said in the moment as he was rallying the men, rallying his sailors, his blue jackets, to face off against the enemy along the coast of Alabama. Now, so we know that most of that is true, right? The utterance isn't exact, but what happened there is true. We also know that he was lashed to the rigging. And as this image shows, you can see the rope. There's two loops of rope around his belt, securing him to the lash. What is forgotten in all of this is the young officer who was very concerned for his superior officer's safety, who actually did the deed, who climbed up, followed him frantically up the rigging and said, please, please come down from there. You're going to put yourself in harm's way. We need you to be safe, or some words to that effect. And of course, Farragut in the moment refused. And so the young officer made sure that at least if the admiral was intent on being up there, that at least he would be secure. Well, here's the young officer who did that. His name is forgotten today. He's John Crittenden Watson. And he was a native of Kentucky. I want to tell you a little bit about his life to put it in perspective so you know how he came to be with Farragut on the flagship Hartford in August of 64. So Watson, as I mentioned, born in Kentucky, that name Crittenden, his middle name, might ring a bell with you. His grandfather was John J. Crittenden, who had a long career in state politics in Kentucky and national politics with three different parties: the Whigs, the Know Nothings, the Constitutional Union Party. He is probably best remembered for his last ditch efforts. It's a failed effort to avert civil war with a legislative package of resolutions and constitutional amendments. It's known today as the Crittenden Compromise. Well, it didn't work, and his grandfather, John J. Crittenden, didn't live to see the end of the war. He died in 1863. Now, grandson, John, pictured here, he remained loyal to the Union, went to the U.S. Naval Academy, and graduated, and then went right off to the war. He is very, very well remembered by his peers for a stormy night in November of 1861 along the South Carolina coast. He hadn't been out of the Naval Academy very long, and he finds himself in a bad situation. The frigate Sabine is there. There's a transport called the Governor with 500 Marines and crew. The transport is foundering, and Watson takes the initiative to get some cables and hawsers attached to the Governor and saves the transport and saves upwards of 500 Marines and crew from disaster. Watson is called out and recognized for keeping the men safe and for keeping both vessels lashed together. Remember, that's the first record we have of Watson actually lashing things together. He's going to do this again with Farragut in 1864. Of course, that's 2 years later. Watson, as you now know, it's Watson who lashed Farragut to the rigging. There's a post-war sketch, a biographical sketch of Watson's life, and it quotes a letter that young Watson wrote to his mother describing what happened. And here's a quote from that letter. It says, "At length, I lashed him to the rigging with my own hands, having in vain begged him not to stand up in such an exposed place." The sketch goes on to note, between the young lieutenant and his gallant commander, there existed a close and affectionate regards, and in his official report of this battle, Farragut made particular mention of his services. And the quote from that report is this: "Lieutenant J. Crittenden Watson, my flag lieutenant, has been brought to your notice in former dispatches. During the action," it's Mobile Bay, "he was on the poop deck, attending to signals and performing his duties, as might be expected, thoroughly." Farragut never mentions how Watson leaps up on the rigging and lashes his boss. Farragut does continue. "He is a scion worthy of the noble stock he sprang from, and I commend him to your attention." Farragut emerged from the battle unharmed, even though he was in a precarious position. Watson, not so lucky. He suffered a slight wound by a shell fragment during the battle. Otherwise, he was okay. There's another reference to the story, another recollection by one of Watson's peers, an officer, a young officer, another young officer named George Dewey, who you may know goes on to fame as a commodore at Manila Bay during the Spanish-American War. Here's what Dewey remembers about Watson and Farragut during Mobile Bay. He says, quote, "Commodore John Crittenden Watson won enthusiastic praise from Farragut when he was attached to the old Hartford as flag lieutenant in the Battle of Mobile Bay, when the Confederate Tennessee," that's the vessel, "engaged Farragut's flagship, and the admiral climbed into the mizzen rigging that he might direct the fight above the blinding smoke. It was young Watson, then acting as signal officer on the poop, who climbed up after Farragut, and after vainly entreating the admiral to stand in a less exposed place, lashed him to the rigging. Watson was wounded in the fight." Watson, as I mentioned, survives the battle with a slight wound. He goes on to enjoy a long career in the Navy, attaining the rank of Rear Admiral, just like Farragut. Along the way, Watson marries, that's in 1874, becomes the father of 8 children, and lives until age 81, dying in 1923. He's buried, by the way, in Arlington National Cemetery. So there you have it, the story of the young, concerned officer who was terribly worried about his commander, Admiral Farragut, during the Battle of Mobile Bay, and went to great lengths to make sure that he was lashed to the rigging when Farragut uttered his famous order. Take care. We'll see you on the next video.